Hi, I'm Tori, and today I'm going to be discussing The Drawing of the Three by Stephen King. This is the second book in the Dark Tower series. It was published in 1985, and I enjoyed it very much. So this series keeps getting more fascinating the more I read it. I've just finished the second book, and I still don't really know what genre the series is. I still don't really know what's happening with the plot or what's going to happen next, but I'm so fascinated I cannot wait to read the next book. So if you want to read this book, I would recommend that you go read The Gunslinger, then The Drawing of the Three, then come back to hear what I have to say about it. So this book was really interesting because the first book, The Gunslinger, seemed like it was all about kind of character development and getting to know Roland and learning a little bit about his past and just sort of setting up the world and establishing that he really wants to find the Dark Tower. This book didn't really touch on any of the past or really any character motivation or anything like that. It felt like it was just introducing new characters and kind of sorting out how the world is going to work. And after reading this book, I feel like now we've had 2 books of setup and the story is about ready to start, and maybe the next book will be more plot-driven. So the opening of this book was very jarring and very brutal. I waited a while between reading The Gunslinger and The Drawing of the Three, and I think maybe I shouldn't have waited quite so long because I didn't remember some of the specifics of how the book had ended. It picks up basically right where the last book left off, and there's none of the backstory. You know, it kind of annoys me in like the Harry Potter series where at the start of every book they'll give you a little summary of what happened last just in case you've forgotten, and this one does nothing like that, which means that you really have to pay better attention, but I like it because you can dive right into the story. So this started out, with Roland just waking up on the beach, being attacked by giant lobster monsters, and losing major body parts and stuff, and that was just so brutal, and I had a hard time starting this book because all those scenes with him being attacked by the lobsters and dragging himself further down the beach were just so kind of painful to get through. But then as soon as he got to the first door and started the drawing of the three, then I was very invested in the story and I had so much fun with it. It was very easy to get through the book very quickly. So even though we had the prophecy and everything in the last book, I went into this one not really quite knowing what the drawing of the three meant. I assumed it was kind of like drawing, like sketching, which makes no sense. I don't know why I thought that. And so then you go into this book and you figure out it is drawing the three through the doors to bring them into this world. And then by the end of the book, you find out that it isn't even quite that. It is drawing the three gunslingers into existence and into a working unit so that they can go start whatever quest they're going to go on in the next book. I thought it was fascinating how easily this transitioned from the last book, which was a Western that felt very kind of old-timey and archaic, even though it's set in the future, to this book, which is set mainly during the present, which is 1985, because that's when this book came out, and like just the recent past, and it's all in New York. And it was interesting how well the gunslinger kind of fit into that world. I mean, he had some difficulties, but you would expect way more, and he was able to assimilate and help all these people navigate their lives pretty easily. I really liked the bond that he developed with Eddie and how they disagreed but kind of learned to work together. And I'm really hoping that he'll use that bond with Eddie to kind of atone for the mistakes he made in the last book with Jake and to actually maybe sort of connect to a human being and value human life, those fun things. I thought that Odetta was a very interesting character, and I don't know anything about multiple personality disorders, so I have no idea how accurate her portrayal was to real life. But for the story, it worked really well, and it was very interesting. And I loved the idea of these two conflicting women. So it was almost felt kind of like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde situation, where it was like this one woman, and they kind of split her personality in half so that everything good and pure and loving about her went into Odetta, and everything harsh and strong and gritty went into Detta. And it reminded me so much of reading Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the way that people described seeing Detta and just feeling how vile she was. But then they kind of had the same reaction to Odetta, because there were several people who just looked at her and fell in love with her. And at first that kind of annoyed me, and then I figured it was some sort of kind of metaphor to show that this one whole woman had kind of been split into two, and all of her good traits were in one half of her personality, and that's why people just instantly fell in love with her. And so then by the end, when you meet Susanna, then that is an amazing character, because she has all of Odetta's quiet strength and her goodness and her desire to do good things in the world. But then she has Detta's fierceness and instincts and ability to survive, and I thought that was really interesting. I will be interesting to see how Susanna's now relationship with Eddie progresses, because he fell in love with her instantly, which makes me think that it wasn't a super genuine love. And then when Odetta and Detta merged, he's still in love with Susanna, even though he had such a violent reaction of hatred toward Detta. Somehow I feel like that's not very sustainable, but maybe they will just be like the two lovers who go off on the side, and that's like their role in the upcoming story. I just felt like their relationship could get a bit rocky. And then there was the third man who Roland went and possessed. And, at first you think he's going to be the third person to be drawn through the doors, but it turns out that Roland really went back there pretty much to get antibiotics and bullets, and he doesn't even, occupy the guy that much. He just, the guy's unconscious for most of the time Roland is there, and Roland is just using his body and running around and doing all these things. It made it feel like the book had way more of a grand plan. It feels a little bit like Destiny or something, to be just like, I'm going to walk down this beach and stumble through these random doors sitting in space in the middle of nowhere. So, it felt a little bit like that to begin with. But especially since pretty much Roland only occupied that body to run errands, that whole segment made it feel much more like outside forces are controlling what's happening. And I'm not sure, it sounds like the Dark Tower is capable of time travel or travel through space and time somehow. So it could be that someone later on is reaching back and controlling this whole thing so that Roland can get to the Dark Tower. Or it could be that there is some kind of a force of destiny in this universe that is driving him. And I'll be really interested to see which of those turns out to be true. I was a little bit confused about Odetta's timeline, because at the very end, when Roland is occupying the guy who threw the brick at her and pushed her in front of the train, it sounds like they're saying that, that first concussion is what made Detta appear. But then Detta's first memory is of breaking the plate at the aunt's wedding, and that was before the brick fell on her. So I was a little fuzzy about the timeline. I'm not quite sure if Detta first appeared before the brick fell or after. So one of my favorite things about this book was that I felt much more connected to Roland, and he is starting to feel much more like an actual human being. They still call him the gunslinger a lot, but now I feel like he is Roland. In the first book, Roland was this strange label that other people would use to refer to him. And now it feels like he really is Roland. He's a human being. And he actually has a bit of a sense of humor. I loved it that he sees these giant lobster monsters crawling toward him, and he decides that they are the lobstrosities, and he uses the word lobstrosities with complete seriousness for the rest of the book, and I love that, because it's like he almost made a joke. He did the same thing when he was possessing the third guy, and he was just using him as a database to look up information, and I think the guy's name was Jack or something, so he uses him as a Jacksopedia or something. He makes up a funny word to describe how he looks up information in him. It's like, oh, Roland, you do have a little bit of a sense of humor. Maybe you are a real boy. And then he's also really starting to think about his actions, and he is regretting what he did to Jake in the last book. He wouldn't change it or do anything differently, but he is regretting it, and he kind of wishes that he could have more of a connection with Eddie and with Susanna. And there is this great moment where he starts thinking about how it's important that he does maintain his humanity when he finds the tower. So he has this inner monologue going, and he kind of says, "If you have given up your heart for the tower, Roland, you have already lost. What if you should, heartless, actually storm the Dark Tower and win it? If there is naught but darkness in your heart, What can you do except degenerate from beast to monster? To gain one's object as a beast would only be bitter comic, but to gain one's object as a monster. And so he actually does have this kind of moment of thinking, I really do need to get to the Dark Tower, but maybe it'd be a good idea if I worked on being a semi-decent human being, or at least like a shadow of a human being, something like that. And so he really is kind of growing, and I hope that he will keep up that progress in the next book, and I'm excited to see how he changes as the story goes on. So I enjoyed this book very much. It was very compelling. The individual elements aren't really things that I would have been drawn to, like, you know, the drug smuggling and the attacks by giant lobsters, but I was so engaged in this story and I had so much fun with it. And now I feel like the story is really ready to start, and I can't wait to read the third book and see what is going to happen.